Okay, so today we take up Gate 54 of the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. I am now halfway through this text. I've been talking about it for years. It seems like a long time. So when Hojo-san, comes on Sundays and says, "This is my 250th talk on this book," it's like, yeah, I get it. I'm not at 250 yet, but it's been a long time. So, Gate 54, which says, "Mind as an abode of mindfulness is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we reflect that mind is like a phantom." So you'll recall we've moved into a section of this text that is talking about the Satipatthana, or the four foundations of mindfulness. So each of these four gates takes up one aspect of this. So body, feeling, mind, and dharma. So we've done the body and we've done feeling, and today we take up mind. We move on to mind. So we can start to see how these abodes of mindfulness are helping us see the process that we go through when we have some experience. There's some sense contact. The body, the senses of the body have contact with something. Something arises and we take action based on that experience. So we start to see how this process unfolds. So body, we have some. Remember, we recall that we had not only five senses but six. The mind is the sixth sense. So body has some contact with something. Some feeling or sensation arises, and we decide immediately whether that feeling is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This week we kind of go on to the third piece of that process, which is the thoughts or emotions will arise in the mind. So step number 3. So mind, in the case of this Dharma gate, is not just intellect. It's not just sort of the intellectual processes that happen here. There's actually a fair amount of variety in the way that the original Sanskrit words for these four abodes are translated. So for mind, it's frequently mental states, right? The state of what's going on here. So it isn't just intellectual thinking. It also includes the feeling tone, and sort of the broader experience there. So this is the point where feeling or sensation gives rise to the three poisons, right? We've had some contact with something, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. This is when we start to, see the three poisons kick in. So we have a pleasant sensation, and greed is immediately there. We want more of that pleasant sensation. We want more happiness, more self-satisfaction, more self-esteem, more reassurance, more, some kind of a pleasant feeling. If we have an unpleasant sensation, then aversion immediately arises, right? We want to escape from anger, greed, fear, shame, all of those. That really makes me crazy. There we go. My apologies for that. Okay, so pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, immediately some, the three poisons immediately kick in. So usually we're pretty unaware of this chain. Suddenly we may be completely hijacked by our response to something. We kind of wonder what's going on. In a split second, everything changes. Our whole outlook changes. So it makes sense to pay attention to how these things arise for us, how they arise in the mind, and how those mental states are really changeable. They are really impermanent. So at the time that we're deep in the throes of some strong something that's happening, we're deep in the throes of misery, or deep in the throes of infatuation, or some other mental state, it feels like that is our entire world, and it's going to go on forever and ever, right? It feels awfully solid. Sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's not good. We like good feelings. We like happy thoughts. We don't want to let go of those things. That's a place we'd like to stay in. We don't like bad feelings. We don't like unhappy thoughts. We would like those things to go away as quickly as possible. We'd like to get out of that place as fast as we possibly can. That's all completely understandable in this human form. That is, not something that we need to try to suppress or that we can't understand. Our practice isn't telling us not to feel things. Our practice isn't telling us, to suppress our responses to the world. This is our human condition. This is the ground of our practice. We're not completely wholeheartedly living this human life if we are ignoring or pushing away or suppressing the things that arise for us. So, there are parts of ourselves, parts of our lives that we don't like so much. We'd like to pretend that they're not there. But as bodhisattvas, that's just not an option for us. That's not what our practice is about. So mindfulness of mind means we know what's going on in our minds. We know and acknowledge when we're feeling attraction, or when we're feeling aversion. We recognize when we're being pulled around by delusion. We're also aware of the general conditions of our minds, whether we're distracted or focused, or clear or concentrated, or what exactly is going on. So that sounds pretty simple, like we shouldn't have to be told about it. Of course I know what's going on up here. I'm in this body and mind. But when we start paying attention, we realize how much of the time things that are happening that lead to action are coming from we don't know where, right? So, these are things that cause us to do things in the world skillfully or unskillfully. They affect our relationships, and we may be completely unaware of what's driving us, or at least not paying attention to that. So, like, where did that come from? What was I thinking? Why did I say or do that thing? So entering into this gate is a real chance to befriend ourselves. I think it's a real chance to become intimate with ourselves and with the totality of our experience. And that's not always easy. And that's not always pleasant. Sometimes we don't like ourselves that much. We see things happening that we think are kind of problematic, and we would not want to enter into that. It's easier to not pay attention to that stuff. It's not easy to befriend somebody that we're not so wild about in this moment. So a little bit of compassion here along with the wisdom is important, especially if we're stuck in habituated thinking. We have patterns of thinking and we're stuck in those habituated thinking patterns. We can be having responses that are really familiar. We're not paying a lot of attention because this is what always happens. We know, I have this experience, I have this response. This thing comes up in my life, I feel like that. It's this habituated kind of cycle. And we can sort of stop paying attention to that. So we can just take for granted that our thoughts and emotions are the only possible outcome of whatever this is that's going on in my life. We can think, well, that process is permanent. If this happens, of course, it leads to happiness. If that happens, of course, it leads to unhappiness. So, we're not paying attention because, well, this is the logical outcome of something. We don't necessarily look at, well, what's really happening in the mind and why are things changing so quickly? Why is there so much impermanence happening here? So taking up this gate is also a way to practice with a really intimate experience of impermanence. What is more intimate than what's going on in this body and mind? It's one thing for us to look out there and say, oh, yes, things are changing. The weather changes, things change out there. Well, okay, what about the internal weather? What about what's going on in here? It's a real chance to touch something in a quite an intimate way. So you'll recall that impermanence is one of the three marks of existence, the other two being interconnectedness and the emptiness of self. So we get a real chance to experience very directly the three marks of existence. So these three marks are characteristic of all conditioned things. So in other words, everything arises from causes and conditions. Nothing arises from nothing. And therefore, everything is impermanent and interconnected and empty. So these three marks aren't actually separate. They're really all pointing to the same thing. If we really dig into them, we see that in many ways we can't really pull them apart. For the purposes of talking about them, we can make some distinctions, but ultimately they are all pointing to this one unified reality. They're all kind of gateways into that. So Uchiyama Roshi calls impermanence one of the undeniable realities. He says that everything that has life loses life. So, that applies not only to beings that we might say are alive, and we can think, well, yes, of course, everything that's born has to die. Everything that has a life eventually loses its life. Even insentient beings are changing all the time, right? So, things as they are changing all the time. The life of something as it is right now is changing all the time. So, this is, of course, also true of our mental states. It can't be disconnected. Our mental states can't be disconnected from the general, moment by moment functioning of this one unified reality. So Uchiyama Roshi says, many people think that simply pursuing material happiness or riches is the most important thing in life. But stand that way of life next to the reality of death and it completely falls apart. When a person who thinks he's happy because of his material situation has to face death, he's likely to fall into the depths of bitterness and despair. If happiness means having plenty of money and good health, then by that very definition, you're only going to hit rock bottom when it's your time to die. When you're faced with death, what good is being healthy or wealthy? That is why all of these materialistic pursuits only end in despair in the face of the undeniable reality of death. So he's giving one example of how quickly our mental states can change. One minute we're happy, because we have things we want, we have everything going for us, things are pretty good. The next moment we're in a hell realm because somehow some part of that has been lost, or even all of it has been lost. So Hojo-san says that when we're unaware of impermanence and we're not sort of, mindful of mind, as this gate says, then ego seems to be the center of the world, right? When then the ego tries to protect itself, and greed and anger arise, and ego thinks it needs things in order to feel safe and in order to feel loved and happy. So we chase those things. Ego thinks it's threatened. It becomes fearful. We run away from things we don't like. So we just see this process happening all the time. And right there we have the beginning of the three poisons as the root of, all of our other delusions, right? They are strong enough in themselves. And out of those three poisons arise all our other delusions, and our bad karma when we take action based on these things, right? Some unskillful things can happen. So Hojo-san says mental formations and the rest of these 5 skandhas can't be controlled because there really is nothing to control them. So the self is empty, right? We can't, in a lot of ways, we can't really control our lives because the self is empty. So this body and mind are not possessions that we control and, sort of operate like we're driving cars around. Right? There's no owner or operator is the way he frequently says that. So he says to see this body and mind as impermanent and unstable is to free ourselves from attachments and to free ourselves from the 3 poisons. So if we try to fix the mind on any particular view, then, that's already a problem. Clinging to some idea is already a problem. Even clinging to the idea that the mind is impermanent is a problem, right? We know. Clinging even to teachings leads to problems. So clinging to mental states creates some hindrances in our ability to clearly manifest Buddha nature, to act skillfully in the world, because Buddha nature itself and awakening itself are already constantly changing. So we can't even cling to that. So Uchiyama Roshi says, we can't shoot down and carry away a ready-made awakening like it was some kind of trophy. I think that's a great image. We want to go out there and shoot something down and carry it home and say, here's my awakening, or here's my very clear, focused mental state. We can't even do that, right? So Hojo-san says, he kind of takes up that same teaching and says, if you feel good or enlightened in certain conditions and you cling to this experience, you are deluded. You are already stagnating in enlightenment. So we just open our hands and keep practicing. This is the meaning of just sitting or of continuous practice. There is no one who is deluded or enlightened. So sometimes this teaching that the mind or mental states are impermanent can feel kind of scary. What do you mean that everything I think and believe is like a phantom? Isn't there something I can hold on to? Isn't there something I can stand on? What do I rely on a moment by moment basis if it's not what's happening up here? Well, deeply seeing the impermanence of small mind naturally leads us to some understanding of no self. These things are really closely connected. So if my mind is constantly changing and there's nothing up here I can point to that, says, well, that's me. Here's Hoko. Then what is the self? And that's a pretty big question. Who's driving this bus? There's got to be somebody in here, right? So, it turns out, of course, that the self is empty of any kind of fixed, permanent self nature. So on one hand, we can distinguish individual people with individual characteristics and personalities. We don't, mix each other up. We can identify individuals. We all have our sort of psychological characteristics. On the other hand, it's also true that we're not separate from the entire functioning of this one unified reality, which includes all the other individual people. And all the other individual, sources of mental activity. So in addition to paying attention to the small mind, the human psychological mind, if you will, we also have to pay attention to original mind or pure mind. This is, mind with the big M. Original mind or pure mind. Original mind is nothing other than awakening itself, because our activities, our mental functioning, our moment by moment activity is not separate from anything else around us. So there's this, the small human psychological mind, and then there's mind with a capital M. So it's simply the moment by moment functioning of this entire universe, or of this one unified reality. We're all together there. We're all interconnected there. So entering into today's Dharma gate is not being separate from original mind. Mindfulness of mind is really not being separate from pure mind or big mind or, whatever you'd like to call that. It's being aware that our individual mental states are arising and changing and perishing and arising again within original mind. So we have small mind functioning within something larger. So far we've talked about impermanence of mind from a sort of modern Zen perspective. This is sort of the contemporary, maybe a bit psychological view of mindfulness of mind, impermanence of mind. But in Dogen's time, there was actually quite an argument going on about whether or not mind was permanent as opposed to the body. So there's some historical context to this as well. People were having quite extended arguments about this idea that, well, the body might arise and perish and be impermanent, but the mind was supposed to go on. There was something supposed to be permanent about mind. So somebody asked Dogen whether the teachings being given by another teacher at that time called Seneca were true. This teacher said that transmigration happens because we don't understand that when the body dies, somehow the mind goes on and returns to this ocean of original nature, whatever that might be. So this was his teaching about how to be released from birth and death. We need to understand mind is permanent, therefore we're released from birth and death. And of course, Dogen completely disagrees and writes quite extended arguments about why this isn't the case. So he says Buddhism teaches that body and mind are not separate. So, if the body is impermanent, how can the mind be permanent? If the body is impermanent, the mind must also be impermanent. In fact, he says the very mind that's clinging to this idea that the mind is permanent is itself impermanent. There is really nowhere to stand in this thing. Even anything we're trying to use to cling to an idea about this is already a problem. He says one other problem for him was that there was some sense that the body was impure and the mind was pure. And that the reason that the mind went on was that there was some kind of innate purity there and that the body was somehow innately impure. And we know from his many writings and teachings about going beyond good and bad, going beyond purity and impurity, that was another problem for him, right? There's nothing inherently pure about this mind. That means it goes on and on and on. So anyway, he says you can't separate body and mind, or life and death, or samsara and nirvana. So using an idea like mind is permanent to escape from this wheel of transmigration didn't make sense to him. So here's what he actually says. In the gate of speaking about impermanence, all dharmas are impermanent, essence and material form are not separate. Why do you call the body impermanent and the mind permanent, contrary to the true principle? Not only that, you should completely awaken to life and death as exactly nirvana. You can never speak of nirvana as outside of life and death. Furthermore, although you have the illusory idea that the understanding that mind is permanent and apart from the body is the Buddha wisdom, distinct from life and death, still the mind with this discriminating view is itself arising and perishing, not permanent at all. Isn't this illusory idea insignificant? just drop it. This whole mind is permanent thing, just kind of let that go, right? That's a big hindrance. So the challenge for us is that it's fairly easy to see impermanence in the body. We don't look like we looked 10 years ago. We've gained or lost some weight or flexibility or muscle tone or something, right? We really can quite clearly see the impermanence of the body. Nobody would argue that this body is permanent or that it doesn't change over time or, something like that. We can easily change the appearance of the body, get a haircut and the appearance of the body changes quite quickly. So, mindfulness of the impermanence of the body is pretty easy. Seeing the impermanence of the mind, I think, is a little bit more difficult. So, we sort of think we've always had the outlook that we have right now. That somehow what sees through these eyes has always been here. That my view of the world has always been this way, or my collection of experiences, makes me think in a certain way. That somehow this is permanent and goes on. So, there are certain things we've always assumed are true. Maybe they are and maybe they're not, but we carry around some assumptions. We've based our outlook on certain beliefs and certain values which we have taken on since we were very small. Our culture, our family, our society gives us certain beliefs and values, and we just think, well, those things are permanent. We never question. So, I've mentioned before here that one of the basic elements of spiritual health is understanding why we believe what we believe. And that's a question we don't frequently ask ourselves, right? So, having that kind of grounding feels stable. It's reassuring to think, well, I'm pretty firm in what I believe. I understand things about the world. I have a particular set of thoughts and viewpoints, and, that's stable and it doesn't change. And it gives me some reassurance, right? That things are not completely, chaotic in my world. So, we go through life with that. And then something happens, right? Maybe it's simply that we go to school and we get some education and we learn some things we didn't know before, and suddenly our outlook changes a little bit. Maybe we grow up and things that were important to us in elementary school or high school are a little less important to us now as grown-ups. Maybe we have some direct experience of something that we've only read about. I think we've all had some experience of reading about a place and then you go there. Oh, it was nothing like what I thought, right? Or reading about doing some kind of craft or sport or hobby or something, and then you actually get some training and start to do it and think, oh, this is not what I thought it was, right? And suddenly your outlook changes on that thing. So maybe it's that our level of suffering arises to a certain point where we fall under the influence of people or organizations that seem to explain our fear. I'm carrying around some suffering, I'm carrying around some fear. Oh, maybe now I'm exposed to something that explains why I'm seeing what I'm seeing. That could be wholesome or not, by the way. It could be we fall in with extremist groups. It could be that we encounter the Dharma and start to practice, right? I mean, influence happens both ways. And very quickly, this mind changes. What goes on here, this mental process, our outlook, the things we hold on to can change pretty quickly. So, suddenly or gradually, our thinking changes. I don't see the world now the way I did maybe before I started to practice. I know that's true for me, maybe true for you. I haven't always been aware that my mind is changing around these things. Practice is like the water dripping on the stone, right? Things can change gradually. Or sometimes we say, practice is like when you walk through mist and your robes become damp, right? So it could be happening gradually or it could be happening quickly, but the mind changes somehow. There's something impermanent here. Some things that were lodged pretty deeply can get loosened, and that can sometimes be exhilarating. There's this feeling of spaciousness, and sometimes that's kind of scary because, like, well, where are my handrails now, right? So it's an interesting process. So I just read an interview the other day with a woman who had become involved with QAnon and got out. And now she was being interviewed about that experience. And she said while she was involved with it, she met up with an old school friend and they had a conversation about how things were going. And this friend said, this isn't the woman I used to know, right? So this woman had been unaware of how much her thinking had changed, right? The things that she had maybe grown up with had flipped over, and this friend said, I don't even recognize you, right? So mind is not permanent. Even the things that we think are pretty stable can be changeable. So we live with the body and mind all day, every day. So it feels like all of these things are the same. It's the same body, it's the same mind, moment by moment by moment. We can see ourselves growing and changing and aging on the outside. We don't necessarily see that change on the inside, but we know that it's going on. We know from our practice that it's going on. So impermanence of the mind in the long term isn't always obvious. And it's helpful to have a gate and some teachings to sort of help us pay attention to mind and see what's actually happening there. So that's why it's easy to think there's a fixed self essence, right? It's easy to miss these teachings about, well, self is empty, because it doesn't feel like that on a moment by moment basis. We feel like there's an identity or a soul or something that persists, something permanent that's uniquely ours. So Nishi Ariboku-san was one of Sawaki Roshi's teachers. And he said this, and he's hearkening back now to Dogen's disagreement with Seneca. The form of the body is born and dies in every moment and keeps moving without ceasing even for an instant. The form of mind is said to be born and die 50 times within the cycle of a day and a night. People ordinarily think that their body and mind are permanent because they use them continuously all their life. But if you reflect on yourself intimately, what we call self-mind and self-nature perishes in each moment. The self-mind and self-nature are annihilated when this body is destroyed. There is no place where this so-called divine self abides. So each week we've been also considering Dogen's piece about the 4 foundations of mindfulness from the Eihei Koroku. So let me read that again. Our Buddha, Shakyamuni, said to his disciples, there are 4 foundations of mindfulness on which people should depend. These 4 foundations of mindfulness refer to contemplating the body as impure, contemplating sensation as suffering, contemplating mind as impermanent, and contemplating phenomena as non-substantial. I, Eihei, also have 4 foundations of mindfulness: contemplating the body as a skin bag, contemplating sensation as eating bowls, contemplating mind as fences, walls, tiles, and pebbles, and contemplating phenomena as old man Zhang drinking wine, old man Li getting drunk. Great Assembly, are my 4 foundations of mindfulness the same or different from the ancient Buddha's 4 foundations of mindfulness? If you say they are the same, your eyebrows will fall out from lying. If you say they are different, you will lose your body and life. So now we're on to the third part of this thing. Buddha says contemplating mind as impermanent. Dogen says contemplating mind as fences, walls, tiles, and pebbles. So I've been saying when we look at this little text each week that I think what Dogen is doing is taking Buddha's more broad adjectives and, that's describing each of these elements and providing a sort of concrete day-to-day example of something we might actually encounter. So different and the same. So it's not so easy to contemplate our minds, right? It's like using our eyes to see our eyes. How can that work? But we can also understand being mindful of fences, tiles, walls, pebbles, as being the same as being mindful of mind. So mind as fences and walls throws us back to original mind with a big M. Mind is awakening. That includes all dharmas, includes all beings, the forces at work on mind, interconnection, impermanence, no self, are also at work on fences, tiles, walls, pebbles, right? It's the same kind of dynamic. So there's no separation between mind and body, or between mind and fences and walls, right? When we see impermanence, we see that everything is impermanent because everything is interconnected. So the small mind is a reflection of complete functioning of reality. A few weeks ago, we talked about how the 6 sense organs come into contact with something, sensation or feeling arises, mind as one of those 6 sense organs. So when it comes in contact with something, some sensation arises, right? It leads to labeling and emotion and action and thinking. So we can think of mind like a mirror. Everything that passes in front of a mirror produces some kind of reflection. That image is not the thing itself, and the mirror doesn't have any control over what passes in front of it and what it reflects and how that reflection gets created. It's just constantly responding to causes and conditions, and it's in complete accord with those causes and conditions. It's reflecting back what's out there. This is simply complete functioning without separation. So the mind, we can think of the mind like that. We can use that image for that. So Dogen says, all day and all night, things come to the mind, and the mind attends to them. At one with them all, diligently carry on the way. So if the mirror is warped or cracked, then the reflection, of course, is also distorted, right? So maybe the image, or maybe the image is of a pool of still water, and then you throw in a stone, and the surface starts to ripple, right? And the reflection changes. So, it's still reflecting everything that goes by, but it's not necessarily reflecting that back in a pure way, right? Because the water is moving, or the mirror is cracked, or the mirror is warped. The reflection changes and distorts too. So sitting zazen is what gets that pool to settle back down, right? The water becomes still again, so that we can accurately reflect what's happening in this moment. Mind can sort of settle down and reflect the way the mirror reflects. So if we're looking at distorted images, we're going to take distorted actions. So we need to settle so that what we're reflecting back, what the mind is reflecting back, is a pure, clear image. So Hojo-san points out that the impermanence of mental states means that actually we can start over when we make mistakes. No matter what they are. When the mirror gets warped, when the mirror gets cracked, when the pool gets ripples in it, he says, the fact that the mind is impermanent means we have a chance, to start over, right? In the next moment, we get to do something more skillful, right? We get to reflect something more accurately. So in this way, impermanence of mind is an advantage for us, because as deluded human beings, we know we can't carry out the bodhisattva vows completely. We know there is always going to be something else to do. There's going to be, a mistake that we've made. Good news is, because mind is not permanent, in the next moment, we get to try again. We get to let go of whatever the mistake was and, do something skillful in the next moment. So if we're mindful of mind, we can transform our thinking and our views when we discover they're not wholesome, or they're not working for us, or they're somehow distorted. They're not in accord with reality. we get to make a change. We get to let go of the delusion, the hindrance, whatever it is. It means that awakening is possible. And so in that way, mindfulness of mind and helping us to see the impermanence of mind is an encouragement in our practice. In one way it's scary, and another way, well, that's kind of a good thing. It means it means we can let go of the things that we've done that didn't work out so well for us, right? So even in zazen, the mind comes in contact with something because we are living, functioning human beings. We don't shut off the brain when we sit on the cushion. So even sitting zazen, this sense organ here is still coming in contact with something, and something is still going to arise. There's still going to be a response. So there's this constantly changing picture show happening, which we know from our experience of zazen, right? We're sitting looking at a wall. Even though the eyes are open, there's this picture show. Something is happening and arising all the time. So mental states are coming and going. Even though we're sitting silently, we're not moving around, we're not engaging with things somehow because of our karma. Thoughts are still unfolding. Things are still going on in the brain. And that's the opening the hand of thought part, right, of our zazen, is those things are happening, those thoughts are arising, those emotions are coming up, and we're not grabbing them. We're letting them come and go, but we're not engaging with them. We're not grasping them, write stories about them, and all of those kinds of things, right? So we can see quite directly the impermanence of mind. And we get to observe that and be aware of it without kind of digging into it, poking our heads into it. So, those very familiar 4 things that we do in zazen, taking the posture, keeping the eyes open, breathing deeply, opening the hand of thought, right there is, our chance to be aware of impermanence of mind and sort of not muddy that up, right? So even in the midst of the activity of thinking, there is the stillness of non-thinking. And that's what we can experience in zazen. So right in the middle of all of this, impermanence of mind and all of this thinking and things arising, non-thinking is already there. Non-thinking is right there. So, thinking happens when there's a me separate from a thought. There's a subject and an object. There's me having a thought and I'm engaging with the thought, and now there's thinking, right? Non-thinking is the brain doing what the brain does and us not grabbing that, us not engaging in it, right? So Hojo-san says, when we are sitting, we do not follow or get involved with our thoughts, nor do we stop them. We just let them come and go freely. We cannot call it simply thinking because the thoughts are not pursued or grasped. We cannot call zazen not thinking either because thoughts are coming and going like clouds floating in the sky. When we are sitting, our brain does not stop functioning just as our stomach does not stop digesting. Sometimes our minds are busy, sometimes calm. Just sitting without worrying about the condition of our mind is the most important point of zazen. When we sit in this way, we are one with reality, which is beyond thinking. So today's gate is about seeing and accepting this changeability of the mind. Even in zazen, when we think we're supposed to, right, have some steadiness or calm or peace or something in our minds, somehow we know something is still going on there. So we can accept that changeability of mind and understand that is the content of our zazen, right? That is the content of this one unified reality. So our zazen is not about not thinking. It's not about nothing happening here. It's not about some permanent sort of solid, steady something. There is still dynamic something happening here, right? So our practice is in the midst of the changeability of mind, there is also stillness. In the midst of thinking, there is also non-thinking. Not thinking, non-thinking. So these things exist together. So Sawaki Roshi says, you lack peace of mind because you're running after an idea of total peace of mind. That's backwards. Be attentive to your mind in each moment, no matter how unpeaceful it might be. It might seem to be. Great peace of mind is realized only in the practice within this unpeaceful mind. It arises out of the interplay between peaceful and unpeaceful mind. So the very impermanence of our minds is an important ground for our practice, because it can feel kind of uncomfortable. If we're feeling scattered, we're feeling distracted, and there's a lot of stuff happening, that's not a comfortable feeling. And yet, because of our practice, we can see what's going on and accept that that's what's happening. So, there's some subtlety there. I think it's not that impermanence of mind is something we need to overcome. It's not a hindrance. It's not a mistake. It is the nature of this human form. right? So we get to accept the impermanence of mind. I think part of entering into this gate is seeing clearly what's happening and accepting that that's what's going on. So it's not an obstacle to anything, right? It's the nature of reality. Impermanence of mind is the nature of reality. So it's not something we need to change or suppress or do something about. Our practice is to just see that clearly and accept it and deeply enter into it. So contentment comes from not wanting impermanence of mind to be other than it is. If as soon as we want that to be different, we're setting ourselves up for suffering, right? Because that's what suffering is about. We want things to be different than they are. So contentment comes from just sort of seeing clearly that that's what's happening and being in the middle of that and knowing that it's okay. So, seeing and accepting the unpeaceful mind is the arising of peaceful mind. We're not struggling with that, unpeaceful mind. And right there, we have equanimity. Right there, we have peace of mind. So just as there is non-thinking in the midst of thinking, there is peaceful mind in the midst of not peaceful mind, in the midst of changing mind. So we might wish that our practice would put our minds into some kind of transcendent place where we're not bothered by things. We have some blissful mind state all the time and it never goes away. And maybe when we came to practice, that's what we thought would happen. I think a lot of people come to practice looking for, how do I get rid of my stress? How do I focus my mind? How do I make myself happier? One of the first things I tell people when they come in looking for that is, sorry, that's not what practice is about. And people can be like really distressed that that's not what they're going to get out of their practice, at least, not overtly, right? Like, that's not what we're here for, we might wish to go immediately to nirvana, and when we hear, well, nirvana is already right here and not different from samsara, we just think, I didn't sign up for that. Right? So agitation of mind, is not a comfortable thing, and yet, our practice is not about pushing that away. So, if we could get to some wonderful place where we could finally achieve equanimity by leaving our changeable up and down mind states behind, that would maybe be very nice, but that's not what our practice is about. If we could avoid our worries about the emptiness of self, wouldn't that be great? Because we hear these teachings about emptiness of self and we just think, well, that's annihilation. That's a scary place to be. So the mind kind of jumps around about those things. Well, of course, again, practice is not like that. So we practice by fully entering into the impermanence of mind, just standing right up in the middle of that and going, yep, that's the nature of reality. So my desire to have something else is kind of counterproductive. I'm chasing after something that is not the nature of this life, the nature of this human form. Changeability kind of goes with territory. So we get to enter into that and accept it and, move through the world in a skillful way in the midst of that. So, to live only in the world of the absolute is something we sometimes hear called Zen sickness or spiritual bypassing. We can't live only in the world of the absolute or a place where it's nirvana, all the time. Nirvana and only nirvana all the time, right? We can't live in that place where we leave behind impermanence of mind, changing mind states, changing internal weather. That's not where bodhisattvas live. So in a way, yeah, that is what we signed up for. When we chose to be bodhisattvas, or we understood that we already were bodhisattvas, that's what we signed up for. Bodhisattvas don't live in a world where there isn't this impermanence of mind. Kind of goes with the territory. So the question is whether and how we recognize and work with this undeniable reality. So what would you like to say about changing mind states, impermanence of mind, other things that may be arising for you based on this gate this week? And be sure you unmute yourself so we can hear you if you have something to share. All of our minds have gone quiet. Jeff, are you waving?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, this is another marvelous talk. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was really well done, as usual. So I have a question, and it's kind of a sidebar, I think, but it did come up for me during the talk. And I mean, you have for now, for me, a familiar way of, reminding us about the impermanence of body. And then you talk about this general pattern, that we gained or lost, all those things that you've said, which I think are really helpful reminders and help us accept our perceptions of those things. And my question is, are there, among individuals who've spent lots of years of practice, and have started their practice at different times in their lives, they've spoken to each other, if they've spoken to each other about it, if there's also a sense of, with this kind of impermanence and changeability of mind in a general way, if there are characteristics of the sensation or the experiential form of practice that is an overlay on top of duration, so that you become more practiced, you go through, I imagine, maybe different stages of it. But if there's also, if there's a kind of musculature and verve that perhaps that young practitioners who have been at it for n number of years, it's characteristic of it. And when you have the same number, when you see what I'm saying?
So I think you're saying there may be differences in quality of practice depending on how long you've been practicing, and there may also be differences in quality of practice depending on how early in life you started.
And there are patterns of causes and conditions that are associated with age and place in the world and other experience that just are there, the way that you would say the same thing about the body.
Yeah. That's interesting. Well, I hadn't considered that. So now that you're saying that, I'm thinking about younger practitioners that I know, and older practitioners that I know, and people I've met who started, maybe even living in a practice community at a young age, and sort of that was their. I don't know. I have to say, I don't have a quick answer for that. And maybe others here would like to chime in based on, we've got some older and younger practitioners in the room at the moment. It would be interesting to chime in on that. On the one hand, if you come to this practice later in life, you may have some understanding of suffering, which is different than a younger practitioner because you've had life experience.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been marriages and divorces and family deaths.
That the equation for sure, yeah.
And so you have some deep experience of suffering, and perhaps ways that you have dealt with that suffering that were wholesome or not. Whereas if you're 22, you've had suffering, because we've all had suffering, but your suffering is different. That would be a really interesting study. I don't have a quick answer for that. It's interesting to consider, though, because most of the people I know actually came to practice at a later age. I mean, I did. I was in my 40s or something, 30s or 40. I don't know. I wasn't 22, right? So it would be really interesting, to have that conversation with somebody who started out quite young. And maybe, as I say, I know people who went into a practice community at a really young age and spent a lot of years there. I mean, spent their whole lives there. So have not had some life experiences that perhaps other people have had. It doesn't mean they haven't had suffering.
Sure.
Right. But they haven't had the same kind of life experiences. So how that has affected their practice would be interesting to consider, because if you think about somebody who's quite a young adult, starting to practice and growing up, if you will, with a sort of a practice outlook on life. When you meet something, here's how we practice with that. I mean, what if I had known that when I was 18? Mm-hmm. How would I maybe be different today? What if I'd had those, I hate to say tools or handrails or coping mechanisms or something, but what if your understanding of what you were experiencing at a pretty young age was influenced by Buddha's teaching? That would be interesting. And as I say, we've got some older and younger folks here. I'd be interested to hear from others here, how they feel about that. Mark.
Hi. Yeah.
I think you're the only Mark today, so I can call you Mark.
Oh yeah. The mark of existing. Yeah, I actually have a direct response to Jeff, and I don't know how to really start to frame it. It can get quite extended. Um, I'll use an analogy for you from my take on this. And the analogy is sitting a sesshin. When I first started this practice, I was deathly afraid of sesshins and all-day sittings. I went to one and it nearly killed me. Well, it did kill me, basically, yeah. The pain, the struggles, forget the mind. I mean, oh my gosh, sitting in place for 3 hours, it was a standard practice. This anti-G stuff, right? So, and I figured, oh, I was an avid weightlifter back then. And so I figured, oh, okay, this is going to be like lifting weights. I went for a day, and, I went for all day sesshin. And then, so I'd go for a 2-day and it would get better. And then I'd go for a 3-day and it would eventually get better. And I think it went up to a 4-day and it would get better. And I actually tackled anti-G, or everything here at Sanshin the same way. I started with a half day, and then I did a full day, then 2 days, and then 3 days. And, behind this is the belief that everything will get better, or I'll be able to handle it. And every time I sat, every time I do sit, that belief is thrown out the window. Nothing changes whatsoever. Well, there are a couple, no, that's an incorrect statement. Things do change. The pain changes. The pain will migrate, a new pain will come up, it will go somewhere else. My acceptance of the pain changes. And that's how I kind of think, or that's how I kind of approach your question, or answering your question, in that the difference between older and younger really isn't different. The more I have sat, when I came into this practice, I thought when I was younger, I thought I was a bright, intelligent, young individual. The more I have practiced, the more I have realized that I am still the same idiot I was before, deluded beyond belief. And those things pop up, those ideas, those things, those pop up. I have feelings, emotions that say I'm a human being and I deserve this, and this, and then they go away. It's the same delusion that pops up and goes away. Same as your thoughts come up, pop up, go away in a sesshin. And that's all that it is. The things that change are the things that it seems like the only thing that seems to really change is just your level of acceptance a given day and what kind of mood you're in. That's about it, which is in and of itself impermanence, right? So that's
I'm hearkening back to a talk that I gave, and I have to say I don't remember which Dharma Gate it was about. We were talking about um, from children through adult how we change our thinking about good and bad. And I'm also thinking, so there is something about how we develop from children and young people and into adulthood, which changes our psychology a little bit, and which is just a natural growth process. And so if I overlay that onto, this is where I'm thinking about Jeff's question. It's like we see things differently because, and Jeff knows more about this than I do. Now we're talking with a psychology prof. So to get good marks on this talk is a good deal for me because it's coming from someone who knows. I'm kind of overlaying that and saying things like our moral development, our ethical development change, from the time we're young people to the time we're older people. We see things differently. It's different. Societal pressure feels different. Peer pressure feels different. At some point we start to let go of I'm going to do this because I'm going to get punished if I don't, to I'm going to do this because this is the right thing to do. And I'm just thinking it's entirely possible somebody who starts practicing at a younger age and here's Buddhist teachings combined with the changing sort of brain chemistry and psychological development, it might change the quality of practice. I think it's a really interesting question. I didn't mean to hog the floor. What would other people like to say about Jeff's question or anything else from today? Jeff, I'm not sure you got an answer. Sawyer, please.
It's fun.
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting question to me, partly because of the the pretty amazing circumstance for me personally to have come to meditation and Dharma at the same time as my parents, about, I think it's something like five years ago or something. So I was 22 when, and my dad sort of instigated it for us all. And then sort of, so encountering the teachings like my senior year of college, and then going off doing different things, living far away from my parents, out west, but practicing, simultaneously, us sort of walking this path, and really just in the past maybe year and a half or two, a kind of a family sangha feeling has developed where we, we have like a little book club, and then now coming back, living in close proximity to my parents, and at this point in our sort of shared path, but they're 30 years older than me, and they have lived as parents. They've had a life of householding, in a way that I was sort of just the recipient of their care for so many years. And I don't know how to frame it. I think one interesting question is how the paramita of energy or enthusiasm, as another teacher I know likes to call it, vigor, how that might be different for a younger person versus an older. Like I can think of my early on, just like diving, with as it started to make sense, the teachings, just so enthusiastic, and becoming sort of attached to, in a more, in some difficult ways, I think that came out of an over enthusiasm or too much energy or something. And where if I look at my parents, they sort of took it a little slower at first, and didn't get, bamboozled in a way that I felt I did. So I guess that's something.
That's interesting.
Fabulous, really fabulous.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, of course, that infatuation with practice is not unfamiliar. Probably most of us here either have some personal experience or we know people, who realized this was it, and you kind of dive in head first. And if you're a young person, that might feel and look different, because perhaps you have the freedom to do that in a way that older people don't because they've got responsibilities, right? That's really interesting. Are there other things to be said? I think Ado was nodding along with me here and probably wants to chime in because she's a longtime practitioner too.
Well, it's not so much about me as a response to Sawyer, in that that's kind of an amazing situation to have you and your parents sort of starting practice at the same time. You have a study going right there.
Well, the natural experiment.
Yeah.
Right. And having adult children, I was also quite amazed when you said that your father instigated this for the family. I never figured out how to do that. So that didn't happen in my family, although my sons are very sympathetic and have some similar ideas and, you know, philosophy. But in terms of practice, they had no interest in that.
Yeah, instigate is kind of a funny word. It was, you know, it wasn't, you know, throwing the hammer down, we're going to start sitting together. It was he was starting to learn about it, and we kind of followed along.
I see.
Well, and you were old enough to be able to do that. You know, had you been younger, you might not have been in a position to do that. So it's really interesting. Causes and conditions, right? Ado, I cut you off. I'm sorry.
Okay. But he was also young enough to, I mean, if you had left home 10 years ago, it wouldn't have happened. In other words, if you didn't have that, you were young enough that you still had this close contact with your family. It's just very interesting. I don't know the answers to this, but I think it's a very interesting discussion. And it makes me think a little bit of an experience I've had this week. Well, recently, actually, sometimes when people get older, somehow for me, I've somehow gotten interested in my past a little bit. And this week I had a friend from high school call me, and it was someone I hadn't seen for 50 years. And he found me and wanted to know what I've been doing for the last 50 years. So we had an hour conversation in which we shared that. And it was interesting because this guy has a rather hoarse voice, and he always did. And he said, one of the first things he said is, "I'm sorry, I'm a little raspy today." And I said, "Oh, more than usual?" Now that was as if I've been with him for 50 years. But the thing is, it was a constant. I remember his very distinctive voice, you know? And so of course we didn't actually know each other. What we knew of each other was from high school and junior high school. But it was very fun to start this dialogue, and it was interesting to, in some ways, connect with him like we had been together yesterday. In some ways, realize that, well, we were total strangers to each other. You know, I mean, like 50 years. So there was just an and one of the things that came up in our conversation is how much we had changed. I mean, not necessarily in the same direction, but I mean, when you think of you and, you know, 15 or 16, and now we're 73, some things have happened in, you know, that time. And at each stage, I think I thought, that was it. That was me. You know, I know me. And then 10 years later, I'm sort of like a different me and trying to understand that other me. You know, like and in my case, there were some very radical changes. I mean, obviously me changed. Anyway, so it's just interesting to reflect about that.
Well, you know, I guess you could call it an advantage. One advantage we older people have is we have a longer time to look back on and say, "Oh, impermanence of mind." It's been impermanent a lot longer for us than for some people.
Maybe a little more obvious.
Yes, indeed. When I look back at the pictures of myself when I worked in a very small television operation and I had the long hair and the makeup and the whole deal, and then I look at this, I just think, yeah, impermanence. What would others like to say this morning? Brian, please. Your mic is doing very strange things. It's breaking up. I'm so sorry. Put something in the chat and then we can read it out if you have a question or comment to make. Technology will not be a barrier for us. In the meanwhile, other things people would like to say? Mahesh, please.
Yeah, my question is on like handling these unpleasant sensations, or how to not want them, how not to push them away, right? How do we actually do that? Is this something that comes with practice and sitting, or because, like, I mean, if I have some pain in the body or something, I want it to go away. That's natural, seems very natural. And in any if things don't go my way, right? Like you want them to be different. Um, and that naturally arises, even though, like, I try to remember this teaching, it's not a natural thing. So how do, yeah, so does it, how do we do that?
Yeah, well, of course, job one is to be aware of aversion arising, right? We have a lot of habituated thinking around habituated response around unpleasant sensations. We do things before we even realize. We're pushing away, we're suppressing, we're running before we even realize we're doing it, right? So if we can be aware of those feelings, sensations, thoughts arising, we get to make a choice. If we're truly, if the unpleasant situation is truly dangerous, we need to do something about it. If I have pain in my knee to the point where I really need to, this is like not healthy, I need to know enough to do something about that, right? But so often we would rather not fully enter into an unpleasant situation. And by not fully entering into it, we really don't understand it. So we have a lot of ideas about this is an unpleasant situation and we can make it worse. We can throw things onto it. We can not see it clearly. If instead I can stop and take a breath and say, what is actually happening here? I can make a better choice about what I'm doing. There are unpleasant sensations and unpleasant situations that we simply need to stand up in the middle of, knowing that because it's impermanent, that it's going to arise and dissolve, right? It's really easy to let our habituated thinking kick in to the point where we don't see clearly what's happening. And when we don't see clearly what's happening, that's when we make mistakes. So if I'm in a room and somebody comes in that I have had a problem with every time I've ever seen this person, and this is going to be an unpleasant situation, what am I going to do? I'm going to immediately become defensive or aggressive or something to protect myself because I know this person is a problem. Well, what if I didn't do that? Would it de-escalate maybe? Would I not say that thing that sets that person off? There's just myriad ways in a day where we try to avoid things that are unpleasant. Now, sometimes it's perfectly reasonable. Don't walk into an unpleasant situation if you don't have to. But sometimes there's no escape, right? We have some unpleasant situation, whether it's pain in the body or, whatever that is. But we know from our zazen and from paying attention to what's arising in the body, sometimes we have an unpleasant sensation in the body. We immediately label it as pain. Therefore, it's bad. Therefore, I have to get rid of it. And if we actually sit there and fully enter into that sensation, well, it isn't actually pain. It's a stretching. It's a burning. It's a something. Is it really an injury? Is it going to injure me? Do I need to move because it's going to injure me? Or is this something which is, it's, not so pleasant, but it's going to arise and go away, right? If we just say pain bad, we stop right there. We never fully enter into it to investigate what's going on. So if we can encounter those unpleasant situations with some kind of spirit of inquiry and not condemn them immediately, sometimes we find they're not all as terrible as we think they might be. So job one is awareness. Is aversion arising? And the next one is, can I enter into this with a spirit of inquiry and flexibility and compassion and say, what's really going on? Then we're, I think, a little bit less likely to grab that sensation and say, pain, bad, act now, right? Can we wait a minute? Can we take a breath? Can we open the hand and say, what's really happening in what's in front of me? So that we're not always being driven by the karma, right, of of our habituated thinking. We're being pulled more by what do I actually want to add into this situation, as opposed to, what is my delusion dragging me around to do with it. So we can, enter into that chain a little bit earlier on, right, before it unfolds into something. Can I see more clearly here rather than letting this thing sort of unfold? That sounds easy to say, not so easy to do, but that's our practice, right? To keep returning to this moment over and over and over and over. What's actually happening here? What am I adding in? What story am I writing? Is that true? Why do I believe what I believe? I don't know if that helps you, but there you go. Do you want to follow up on that at all?
No, I think that's good. Yeah, thank you. I think, as you said, it is easier to
It's easier
understand
to
intellectually,
say.
but hard to practice. Yeah, but I think it'll probably come with sitting. Yeah, thanks.
Well, it is harder to practice, and part of the reason it's harder to practice is that we're so often not aware of the changeability of mind. Oh, something's entered in. Oh, I'm having some response. It's like, it's so habituated, we don't even notice it. So job one is notice it. Oh, this is an unpleasant sensation. What am I going to do with that? Or not, right? Do other people want to say something about that or anything else today? Mark?
Yes, there's a prime example to that, or there's a prime example that we just experienced, that what you're talking about, that awkward pause of silence after you ask, hey, does anyone have anything to say? Seriously, in a group discussion, it is a very pregnant pause that is very painful. And if you look at it, if you're leading the group, when you look at it, it's a very painful, and you want to keep the conversation going. But that's not looking at the situation. That's looking at yourself back in and not taking that step back. It's a really good practice point, silence, in many different forms.
That is completely right, because of course, if you're the person who's just been presenting or speaking and you get no response, you think, well, either nobody understood me, nobody cared about my topic, you really take it as a personal sort of response. So it's a great example, right? I've had to learn, like, just don't fill this space. Because you want to run away from that. Oh, that's unpleasant. I don't like it. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to do something about it. Well, maybe I don't have to do anything about it. Maybe it's really okay. People need a minute to formulate a thought, which is fine. Excuse me. Other things this morning. Sagan.
Yeah. As you were talking, somehow the koan that I've been struggling with, kind of the difference between acceptance and approval. I mean, I've really, over the past years, you've kind of mentioned that on occasion, and it was always clear to me that there was some kind of difference between them. But somehow today, it seemed very clear to me the distinction, as you were talking about how, in our sitting, we're letting go. Thoughts are coming and thoughts are going. In a sense, the acceptance is like the big all-inclusive mind, and so there, within that, there can be moments of I don't approve of this, or I approve of this, I don't like that, I like this, and I don't. In a sense, somehow, as you were talking, that distinction, that separation between those two things became clearer to me.
That's interesting. So if we put acceptance is not approval, compassion is not condoning, next to small mind and original mind, that's really interesting. I think that's a great illustration of how those things can coexist, right? On the one hand, we have unpleasant sensations. We can accept that we have unpleasant sensations. That doesn't mean we approve of them, right? It doesn't mean they're okay. Doesn't mean we don't need to take some action there. But job one is to accept them, to see them clearly and accept them, rather than immediately, running. Can we stay there long enough to look at it carefully and then decide, do I approve or not? Is it wholesome or not? Do I need to take action or not? That's an interesting intersection. Thank you for that.
Yeah, because I think when we don't, when non-acceptance arises, we sort of shut down the whole thing, and we say no further.
Yeah, and that's when we fall prey to our delusions, right? And our habituated thinking. Something kicks in, right? Because we've close down, as you say, that process of observing and mindfulness and being aware of what's happening and sort of choosing a wholesome action if we can. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Mahesh, please.
Yeah, I mean, so there are two aspects to this, right? One is like the like not like, let's say you find a difficult person, not trying to bring your old ideas to the picture, seeing it fresh and all those things to do with the mind, where or our thoughts, where we are clinging to certain thoughts and past habits, right? There is that aspect, and then there is the aspect of actually being with the physically painful sensation. Like it can be that emotions that are brought up due to the situation, or it could be like a physical pain in your body due to like something else, right? So I think the former is probably like, okay, it's learning that, okay, like you read some books and like, let's say Byron Katie is like this loving what is, or there's certain books which talk about like, okay, don't believe your thoughts, like really look at your thoughts, and then it's all intellectual. It can probably be practiced or done, but so with respect to this physical pain or emotions, difficult emotions that you need to handle, right? Like it's just like being with them, right? Bearing that pain or being with them. Is there anything else other than that helps there, or? Because I see that's the main difficult. Even if, let's say, if I have to, I talk to someone else and someone else suffering, and I have to tell them like to just not think about it, or like let go of these thoughts and all those things. That is okay to some extent, but still, that physical pain or that emotions are there, which it doesn't help them really.
Right. Yeah. Well, so if we're trying to help others around us, in a way, that's kind of a different ballgame. Because we can say all the things, and somebody who is in the throes of misery, that is not helpful. That is not what that person needs at that moment. What that person needs at that moment is to have that suffering seen. That you're sitting with that person and saying, I see that you're in pain. There may or may not be something you can personally do about the pain, but simply for somebody to know and see and understand, somebody sees that I'm suffering. Somebody takes my suffering seriously, is really important. Depending on the kind of suffering, of course, if there's a remedy, that'll change. Somebody who's in physical pain, there's things you do about physical pain. Somebody who's in emotional pain, maybe it's simply that person needs to be seen and heard. Maybe that person needs, referral to healthcare. But job one is really, so for ourselves, when we're suffering, we sort of need to witness our own suffering. Right? I mean, we need to acknowledge our own suffering, which sometimes we don't want to do. If we're working with other people, sometimes it's the same kind of thing. I see you, I take your suffering seriously. I know that you're in pain. I'm sorry. It doesn't mean we have to assign blame. Doesn't mean we have to see, oh, how terrible that is. Somebody who hurt you is a terrible guy. We don't have to do that. We just have to sort of enter into that space with that person. That's what compassion is, to feel with somebody, or empathy is to feel with somebody, right? So there may not be something we can actively do to remove somebody else's suffering, but simply to enter into that space with that person and have that sense of interconnection is half of it, at least. Right. Some others here have done chaplaincy work or other kinds of things. Ado's got her hands up. Somebody else can probably say some additional stuff. Ado, do you want to jump in?
Well, this just reminds me of a friend who had to euthanize her cat yesterday, and it was pretty clear that this person needed support. I mean, but it wasn't like I was going to change anything, like the grief. That's just sort of a process that she needs. That's her own process that she's going to have to go through. But so I had no expectations about fixing that or changing that. And I think sometimes the problem is, if we looked at every pain as sort of like grief and realize that we aren't going to change it, we aren't going to fix it, we're going to maybe accompany that person or sit and let them know that we are accompanying them in whatever pain it is, and not think in terms that we're going to actually change it, but that it can have tremendous power. Like, so my friend, I told her that I had told all, I listed all the people that I had told about her suffering and that they were thinking of her. And it made a huge difference to her in how she experienced her pain. It didn't lessen it, but feeling supported was amazingly significant. And so it's not a little thing to just be with somebody in their.
Yeah.
It's a really big thing.
So and just I see you, Sagan. I want to follow up with Ado on one thing though. In your professional experience as a physical therapist, you often deal with people who have pain in the body. Do you have some things that are relevant for this group also that you might tell those folks about how you approach that experience of pain? You're muted. You've turned off your mic. There you go. No, you're muted. You're muted. Now.
Okay. Well, I tend to be rather lighthearted in those difficult situations. And that's just kind of my personality. So a lot of people who can, report their pain. Also, many people depressed about their aging. And so, I would also remind them that the alternative is not necessarily better. We are still alive, so there is something to be grateful for. What are we going to do with it? This is the situation. I have this pain. And yes, we'll try to relieve that pain, but the condition of the body is declining. I mean, it's inevitable for all of us, and many of my clients were elderly. And so mostly what I did was try to guide them into thinking about it differently. I mean, the other element with that is a lot of people sort of they didn't like, this is really hard for people, becoming dependent on other people's help.